One, two, three, four. I got thoughts running through my head. I got thoughts, can't you see? I got thoughts, the books I read. I got thoughts, won't you listen to me?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Author Has Thoughts. I am the author in question, Gary Ballard. I'm the author of 12 novels and novellas, including 5 novels in a cyberpunk series called The Bridge Chronicles, and a Cthulhu-based Lovecraftian cosmic horror series called The Stepping Stone Cycle. Now, my last bazillion whatever videos have been focusing on my Cthulhu series, The Stepping Stone Cycle. The last one was on the Metal Black, which is the second episode in the series. Now, I've recorded some stuff for the third episode in the series, but I thought I'd go ahead and cut in here and start my series on the Bridge Chronicles. Now, for those of you who don't know, and most of you who are watching this probably do know because those books have sold better than the Cthulhu books, the Bridge Chronicles is my original series of novels. There are 5 novels in all, as well as a short story collection. The novel started with Under the Amoral Bridge, written in 2008, published as a blog, and published as a book in 2009. Then followed by The No Circuit, If Tribe Equals, The Long and the Short Swords, and Reclamation. There was, as I said, a short story collection known as Tales from the Bridge Chronicles Volume 1. Now, originally there was going to be a Volume 2, and I started writing it, and that became Book 5, Reclamation. The Bridge Chronicles is actually the prequel to a series I had started writing many years ago. And for the origin of that, I have to go all the way back to 1994. I had just graduated college and was working at a place called Wolf Camera in a mall. This was back when malls were still a thing. And working in the mall, you would be bored out of your stinking mind most of the time, especially during weekdays. Now, you might have the occasional weekend event where you get to watch a troupe of roller skating Elvi, true story, or you might have some jackass running through making a scene, but for the most part, mall work was boring as hell. And at a camera store, which also did film development and such like that, it was doubly boring because most of the time you were just taking people's film orders and, you weren't selling cameras. So rather than do any actual work, I would stand around, and you had to stand, and come up with stuff. And in this case, I came up with a cyberpunk role-playing game, pen and paper role-playing game. Now, let me preface that. I was not a fan of cyberpunk at the time. I had not really read anything, and I don't believe, I had only just the previous year, 93, seen Blade Runner. Hadn't read any William Gibson, though I knew of him, and had seen and read some things that were cyberpunk, but I didn't really think of them as cyberpunk, or didn't necessarily read them because they were cyberpunk. And I knew of the 2 big pen and paper role-playing games that were cyberpunk, the Cyberpunk 2020 by Mike Pondsmith from R. Talsorian Games, and Shadowrun by FASA, I believe. By the time I started writing this, I had not played either system. I had, read some of Cyberpunk 2020. I'd bought some of the books and read it, and I later ended up running a Cyberpunk 2020 campaign for 2-3 years at least with a bunch of buddies of mine. And I had not, the only Shadowrun I had been exposed to was when I worked, the year previous I worked at B. Dalton's bookstore, which used to be the mall version of Barnes & Noble before Barnes & Noble started putting big stores everywhere. And I had seen, again, mall work, so I'm bored as hell, and I would sit there and read through some of the Shadowrun stuff, but not extensively. And my idea was to come up with a cyberpunk RPG world where magic existed, but we didn't have the usual fantasy tropes of orcs and goblins and elves and all that. It's kind of like Shadowrun without those extra fantasy tropes other than magic. At the time, I don't believe anybody was calling that sort of genre urban fantasy, which I think is what it's called now. There was a few writers that were doing it, like Emma Bull, I believe, had written some stuff. And Dresden might have been around, but it wasn't as big, the Dresden Files. And Dresden was more present day noir detective stuff as opposed to cyberpunk. So most of the exposure to cyberpunk I had and to this type of thing would have been through the RPGs. So I decided to come up with an RPG that had magic but didn't have elves and things like that. So I'm writing and I come up with this system and of course the world behind it. And at the time I was somewhat naive about RPG creation, and I thought, yeah, I could just do it. Didn't really have to think too hard about probability and math and all that. And in later iterations, one of my beta testers proved to me that that was kind of important by cheesing the ever-living fuck out of the rules and, pretty much threw it away. Because he just became an unkillable stopping machine, or an unstoppable killing machine. That's the one. So I eventually ended up canning the RPG and just not really doing much with it. But the lore was there, and I had always intended and had actually started writing a series of novels that was the backstory for this world and for the campaign that I had been running, that I would have been running, and I did run some with some of my friends, who seemed to like it. The first iteration, second iteration went horribly awry. This idea of this, this big expanded world, based off the main series of events, is what originally I created and started writing, and I ended up writing the first novel that was so large I actually cut it into two and pared it down and played with it a little bit. And I really, in earnest, it took me a long time because it was my 20s and I was fucking about. So I didn't really start writing the novels in earnest till after 9/11, 2001. I had been running a guild on EverQuest, and 2001 hit. I just turned 30, and I guess that whole existential angst of what the fuck am I doing in my life hit me, and I decided to quit EverQuest, and I switched to a different MOG, but decided that, hey, I needed to get serious about writing this novel, so I started writing it. It took me a few years, but I finally ended up writing that big novel and sending it off for publication. Well, one of the things about mainstream publishers that gets on my tits is a lot of them don't expect you to have simultaneous submissions. So you submit it to them, you wait for their response before you can submit it to somebody else. It's great for them, doesn't do much for you when you send off a manuscript in the mail and a year later you get a rejection and you've wasted a year not having that book published. When you could, and you've probably read through the book again and been like, wow, I need to change this, this could be better, that sort of stuff. So I did that with a few publishers for about 2 years, up to about 2007. And blogs had taken off and they were kind of a big thing, but this was slightly before social media, or right at the cusp of social media just starting. So I decided that let me see if I can get some traction amongst agents or publishers by writing a new novel and putting it out as a blog for free. One chapter a week, or one chapter every other week. I think it was one chapter a week, or half a chapter a week, something like that. And just show, hey, I'm writing, my writing is good, here's some stuff. And so in order to do that, I wanted to write a novel that was based around this other novel that I had been shopping around. But I didn't want to, I obviously didn't want to put that novel out because I'm trying to sell that novel. So I'm like, okay, well, let me do a prequel. I know, people hate prequels. I blame Star Wars. Thanks, George Lucas. But I wanted to do a prequel, but I didn't want to do a prequel that was specifically about the things in that first novel or those characters. I wanted maybe to have those characters interact in there, but not be about those main characters. So I had to come up with somebody that was the main character. And I thought of this novel as a bridge between the lore and backstory of that RPG and the actual novel. So with the novel being a bridge, I thought, let's call the main character Bridge. That would be a good name for him. And so I came up with the character of Artemis Bridge. And Artemis, he got the name Artemis actually from an old show from the late 50s, early 60s called Wild Wild West, which, yes, it eventually became the Will Smith movie, but originally it was a black and white TV show that was fantastic.
What's embedded in you? Propelled by a small powder charge. You note how the shock of impact activates the injector mechanism? That's beautiful, isn't it?
And one of the main characters in there was not the main character, not the really big badass, but kind of the main character's Friday, and his name was Artemis. I thought, cool name, who would ever use Artemis? Come to find out years later, as I'm trying to get some search engine juice for this blog and for my websites, that somebody had come up with an independent computer game called Artemis Bridge Simulator. So you would get, if you just search for Artemis Bridge, you get Artemis Bridge Simulator and Under the Amoral Bridge. And I'm like, thanks a lot. Great. Thanks. Hope it's a good game. Never played it. Artemis Bridge. And I didn't want Bridge to be your typical protagonist. I wanted him not just to be an anti-hero, because anti-heroes are part and parcel of Cyberpunk. And I didn't want him to be a hacker, because again, that's pretty typical Cyberpunk. Even though technically he was a hacker at one point. But I wanted him to be the kind of character that a buddy of mine had actually run in our Cyberpunk campaign, which was a fixer type character. If you've ever seen one of my favorite Cyberpunk movies, Strange Days, starring Ralph Fiennes, well, Ralph Fiennes' character in that was Lenny Nero. He was a fixer.
Keith. Keith?
Yeah.
Hey, Lenny. Lenny Nero always spoke on the phone. Hi.
Okay.
Not to be rude, Keith, but I gotta ask. Are you a cop?
I loved that character, loved that movie, still do to this day, even though, it's a little bit dated, but still a good story in my opinion. But I wanted a character kind of like that, kind of like a Lenny Nero character, somebody who's not what you consider your typical hero, typical protagonist, somebody who skirted the line of morality, who generally didn't give a shit about morality. As a matter of fact, his underworld nickname is the Amoral Bridge. He's always surprised when people know what amoral means in the underworld, because he doesn't tend to have a lot of respect for those folks or their intelligence. So, the Amoral Bridge, Artemis the Amoral Bridge, and when I was trying to come up with a title for the first novel, the Red Hot Chili Pepper song, one of the two Red Hot Chili Pepper songs I actually like, Under the Bridge, kept coming to my head for some reason. Because I knew this was going to be an LA story. This was going to be, based in LA. That was a setting, and so for some reason, Under the Amoral Bridge, that song Under the Bridge kept sticking with me, and so the title became Under the Amoral Bridge. If you think of like Peter Lorre's character in the Maltese Falcon, that little Weasley rat-like guy who will turn on anybody for the right price or to save his ass, basically a rat fucker. That's Bridge, except he's not unattractive. He's mediocre attractive, and and he has confidence. He doesn't weasel around. He's not that kind of guy, but he's that kind of guy inside. He's that kind of guy who's always looking out for number one and doesn't have any problem stabbing you in the back if it saves his ass or gets him money. But through the series, we also find out that he does actually have a moral code. It's just a little flexible. It's flexible and it's not overt. It's not something it's not something he relishes. He just does things, not because they're the right reason, but generally because somebody pissed him off, or he feels like, he's like the person that he's fucking and fucking back. Tried to fuck him, so he's going to fuck him first. But again, not for an immoral reason, but because he doesn't want to get fucked. Her name is Rio and she dances on the sand.